So we've got a lot to get through and not a lot of time, so we'll jump straight into it. Hi, my name's Kade. We'll be having a look at threat modeling when you've never done it before. So just a very, very quick word about me. So I'm a consultant with quantum security, and my interests lie around the intersection of privacy, security, and geopolitics. So I mentor with Mozilla's Open Leaders program, and this is going to be the story of going from knowing really nothing about threat modeling to getting a bare bones, good enough process that you can pass on to a non-technical team that they can then take on and run with that. And I want to stress, this is definitely the beginning and not the end. So this is not a holistic look at end-to-end application threat modeling. This is just getting you started so that you can then take that further yourself. So the Mozilla Open Leaders program, basically Mozilla will take open source projects if you have a social good bent to it, and you can apply to be mentored. You'll be taken through a curriculum that is basically best practice for open source projects, and if you complete that and you do well, you might be invited back to mentor. And if you are mentoring that project as well as teaching people the curriculum itself, you can help out with providing skills-based assistance to the groups you're mentoring. One of the groups I was helping was called Asuntos del Sur. So they're a not-for-profit that operates across Latin America, and their basic remit is they are trying to create a more democratic and inclusive society is what they do. And they were looking at building an application, and I was running them through the curriculum, and they said to me, well, considering you're a security consultant, can you help us do some threat modeling for this application we're building? And I said, well, I've never actually done threat modeling before. However, I got into information security off my own back, doing my own reading in my own time. This should be something that I can go away, I can quickly synthesize something that I can then pass on to my group, and they should be able to get to a bare bones process. So that's what I did. I had a look online. I basically settled on the Microsoft Stride format for threat modeling, and reading that, I basically just formulated that down to 3 basic questions that I could then pass on to my team. And if there's one thing that I want you to walk away from today, it is just, what are these 3 questions that we're going to have a look at? So what is it that you're building? Because you can't protect what you don't understand. What can go wrong? And we're going to use the STRIDE acronym to have a look at that, so hopefully in a nice overall manner rather than sort of narrowing in on sort of one area and then neglecting other aspects. And then finally, what is it that you're going to do about it? So this is just a bare bones get you there. This is not the complete end-to-end process, but this is something that you can start with. Before we get into threat modeling itself, I want to have a look at some terms because the terms for risk, vulnerability, and threat are used a little bit interchangeably in this field, and they are distinct ideas in and of themselves that we do need to narrow down. When we think about risk, what we're talking about there is the possibility of loss or injury. The big thing to take away here, it's an event. It's something that can potentially happen. A vulnerability can be described as an opening to attack or damage. So the point is, it's an intrinsic aspect, be that about ourselves or be that about whatever it is that we happen to be building. And then what is a threat? So a threat is an indication of something impending. What we are talking about in this context is we are talking about something or someone that may inflict that loss or injury upon us that we mentioned before. When we put all those terms together, so as an example, a non-information security example, we may all die. That is the risk that we are running, because we are malnourished, which is the intrinsic vulnerability to ourselves. And our bodies can't fight off the plague, and the plague is the threat that we care about there. In information security terms, our web application may disclose information about our users, so that's the event, there is the risk, because hackers, which is the someone, so that is the threat, exploits the lack of sanitization of inputs for the web application itself. So that's the vulnerability that was then exploited. So the big thing that we want to take away from here is the plague and the hackers. These are the threats that we are concerned about. So what is threat modeling at its most basic terms? all it really is trying to identify what these threats are, how they pose danger to us, and we basically just want to put things in place to mitigate or hopefully prevent completely that injury or loss. Now, threats may leverage vulnerabilities to attack us, and if they succeed, then that risk has eventuated, but it's the threats that we really want to be concerned about when we think about the threat modeling. Back to our story and into our first question, what is it that we are building? For the example that I'll run through for the presentation today, the group I was working with was building an application called Power. So the idea was they were finding that they were having issues getting evidence, photographic evidence and footage submitted as evidence in court. They were finding that the evidence was just being ruled inadmissible and thrown out. So they were hoping that if they had a forensic chain of custody behind this, that the judges would be more lenient around it being admitted. And the idea is you'd be able to attend a protest, you'd be able to film what is happening there, and you could take that footage and you could upload it into this app that you would have on your phone. The application itself would have a fake front end, so if your phone was seized, hopefully whoever seized it shouldn't be able to get into the application. And the footage is sent off to a cloud storage. So hopefully if your phone is seized and you don't get it back at all, that footage can still be accessed. That's what they came to with their idea. This is what they wanted to build. And they didn't have any technical people on their team at this moment, so this was just human rights activists that had come to me and just said, look, we're getting some grant money together, this is the idea that we want to build, and we're searching around for developers at the moment. I said to them, okay, so here is some basic information on some threat modeling. Go away, get me a network diagram of what it is that you're looking to put together, think about some of those threats, and then we'll start to work through that and see where we get to. And this is what we have. It's a pretty basic network diagram, and it's the best that we can do under the circumstances, but we'll run with it for the example today. They've done, considering they didn't have any technical experience, they've done a relatively good job. They've even got things around trust boundaries. So the idea for trust boundaries is if information is going to change from one environment to another. So here we have boundaries around the application on the phone itself, and then if you are moving from the phone over the internet to that cloud storage, you're going to transition from one boundary to another. And that's an indication to us that we're leaving one environment, moving into another. That could be an egress for attack, so we should be mindful of that. Having a look at some of the threats they came up with though. Some of these are quite good. So where they were talking about someone hacking into that cloud storage, someone DDoSing that cloud storage. So these are definitely things we'll have a look at. But some of the other ones around like violent repression, intimidation, physical attack, kidnapping, this kind of stuff, I said to them, like for an application threat model, like these are not things that we really can be concerned about, unfortunately. They are definitely problems that like people that you work with are definitely facing on a day-to-day basis. However, for the application itself, we can only look at what is attacking the application. Or even if it is involving in the application in some way, but we can't really think about what is threatening the users per se. So we need to work through some of these threats. Now, as I said, this is pretty high level, and this is pretty much the level we'll stay at for the presentation, given the fact that we didn't have developers on the project at this time. If you want to go away and you want to do this threat modeling yourself, you need to have a little bit more information in that network diagram. You'll want to have a look at the different technology that you're using. You want to have a look at the protocols and how all that technology is talking to each other. You want to enumerate the functionality your application is going to have and think about the different ways that that can be abused. So a common example is a password or a PIN reset can often be attacked by someone who doesn't know credentials trying to get into the application. And you're going to want to flesh out your connected systems as well, because it's not just the application here we're talking about. We listed that there's cloud storage there, and when we start to talk about some of these controls, we're also going to have a look at a code repository and a log server. Now, we have an idea of what we're building as much as we're going to get at this point. Moving on to the second question, what is it that can potentially go wrong for us? So Stride is a framework that Microsoft have come up with, and these slides will hopefully be on the website a little bit later, so you can have a look at these links post-presentation should you want. But basically, STRIDE is an acronym that stands for spoofing of identity, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. So we'll have a look, we'll go through these and have a look at sort of what they may be in the context of this application we're working with. So we've removed our threats. We're going to go over the threats, see if we can get a bit more of a more accurate look at sort of what is it that can be potentially attacking this application itself. And I approached my group and I said, what are you concerned about in the context of spoofing of user identity? And they told me, well, we are concerned about someone like posing as a user to get access to the application. I said, yes, that is definitely something we should be worried about. We may also want to be thinking about someone trying to get access to that cloud repository, so posing as an employee to get access. Or someone potentially trying to get into your code repository because you're going to have source code somewhere that's going to be maintained. So that's something you need to be considering as well, one of these other connected systems. Now, tampering. I asked the group, what are you considering for tampering? They said, well, we're concerned about someone tampering with the information that's stored in the application itself and potentially when it's being sent over the network to the cloud storage, someone might tamper with it in transit. I said, yes, this is definitely something you should be worried about. You may also want to worry about someone tampering with your source code and someone actually tampering with the information once it gets into the cloud storage itself. And when we add a log server, we'll be worried about someone tampering with logs as well. Now, repudiation. There isn't a lot that we're going to have a look at for this specific application that we're having a look at. When I asked them what they were concerned about for repudiation, they said, well, we're concerned about if we have evidence that's submitted into court and someone claims it's not them. So let's say that the evidence is submitted, the defendant stands up in front of the judge and says, it wasn't me, Your Honor, it was my twin brother, or something to that effect. There's not much that we can do about this. So again, it was a conversation around we need to be thinking about the application itself. There is a little bit to consider around potentially users. So like we will have users that will be in that cloud storage, in the code repository, doing their day-to-day operations. If someone was to say that they didn't do something they actually did, or vice versa, that is a problem, and we will have a look at that for logs. But otherwise, there's not much that we'll have a look at for this specific example. However, for an application that you're working on, it may be a use case that you need to be considering. So if you're running an e-commerce website, so this example where someone makes a transfer and then claims they didn't make that transfer, or they can claim that they made it for a different amount, or anything like this, that may be something that you need to think about for your application. Now, information disclosure. I asked my group, so what are you concerned about information disclosure? And they said, well, we are concerned about if evidence is submitted and someone is implicated as being present at a protest when they didn't want their identity known. That may land them in hot water. I said, yes, again, we are looking outside the application itself, but there is potentially something we can have a look at here. So I included that as something that we'll have a look at for the threats that we'll try to mitigate. And we probably need to go a lot deeper here. So given the fact that we didn't have any technical people on the team at this point, it was a little bit difficult, but we definitely need to be making sure we're across the technology we're using, the protocols, the functionality, and all of this. It may be that when we actually get down to it and we have a look at the protocols that we're using to send information to that cloud storage, that it's being sent in clear text, and there's information about the user in that clear text, well, that's something that we need to be concerned about. So I said to them, I said, when you actually start to write your code and you're actually getting this application built, you need to go through this process again and make sure that you really, like, one, get the technology down, but two, make sure that you really hammer in on this process around disclosing information about users. Denial of service. I asked my group, what were you concerned about for denial of service? And they said, well, we are concerned about someone DDoSing the cloud storage. Someone just physically sending packets at it to knock it over. And I said, yep, that is definitely something you want to be worried about, but you also may want to consider the idea that someone may just be uploading information continually into that cloud storage. You're a small not-for-profit working across a couple of legal jurisdictions, like you're already doing a lot. Your money's stretched thin, cloud storage is not free. That may be like an easy way for an attacker to just like attack you monetarily and just wipe out your funds. And then finally, elevation of privilege. So I asked them, what are you concerned about for elevation of privilege? And they said, well, we are concerned about someone getting access when they shouldn't have admin rights to the code repository and the cloud storage, which are definitely threats, so we'll note those down. And then finally, there was one more thing that I suggested they should potentially have a look at. It doesn't fit perfectly into our acronym, but I said, given the fact that you're working across a couple of different countries, you're thinking about having an application that's going to be taking information from one legal jurisdiction, taking that information across borders and storing it in another country, that may be something that you want to have a look at as far as the legislation in each of the countries you're operating in. There may be something you need to be aware of as far as things you need to be complying with and that kind of stuff. So I said that's just a final tack on that you need to be mindful of considering the use case that you're looking at. We now have as good idea as we're going to get of what we're building, and we now have a decent idea of what can go wrong for this application itself. So what is it that we're going to do about all these problems? So this is where we stand. We now have a decent idea of our threats. We've got like these good threats that we can actually do something about. For spoofing of user identity, the problem there was someone trying to pose as a user to get access to either the application on the phone itself, into the cloud storage, or into the code repository. So now we're just going to pragmatically just throw in some controls that are just going to mitigate some of these problems, get them down to a bit more of a manageable level, and then my group should have an idea of as far as, okay, this is how we start, and then we can continue to iterate upon this. So I said, just as a quick, like off the top of my head, the things that you should be having a look at is think about how you're handling credentials for all of these different services. Credentials should be hashed with a secure algorithm with SALT. You should have two-factor authentication on the cloud repository and your code repo. You should have IP whitelisting on both of those if that's technically feasible for you. Those two controls are really, really quite strong for what we're looking at here. We are potentially concerned about like someone trying to get access into these services. If we're saying, well, you need either a hard token or a soft token on someone's phone, or you need potentially the device they're coming from for the IP address, you start to stipulate that they need to have physical proximity to these things. They can't just be sitting anywhere in the world without some level of sophistication to spoof an IP address, somehow snatch an SMS, and all of that kind of stuff. So these controls start to get quite strong and help my group quite a lot. Finally, we want to have an access control policy. So we want to make sure that accounts are tied to identity. So none of this, when we go into the logs and we have a look at what's happened, and it's just, oh, admin has done this. We have no idea who admin is because everyone has access to the admin account. None of that. We want to make sure that accounts are tied to identity. We want to make sure that permission is only given to users as and when they need it. People just aren't given admin for no reason at all. We want to make sure that accounts are revoked if someone leaves the team and they don't perform that job anymore, or they leave the organization altogether. We want to make sure that you're auditing this, so you're regularly checking that there are not accounts sitting there that are overprivileged or someone could just come along and take should they want. And you want to make sure someone is responsible for all this. Someone is going to, the buck is going to stop with them as far as making sure that all of this gets done. Because if you don't hold someone responsible for it, then it's just not going to happen. Your team is just not going to do it. This is where we stand, and now we've got our access control policy in, we're hashing credentials, and we're having a look at two-factor authentication and IP whitelisting for our connected services. Tampering. So the problem there we were having a look at is someone tampering with information on the phone itself, in transit, in between the phone and cloud storage, and then in the cloud storage itself. What we want to do is we want to hash that file at different points so that we can make sure that that file has not been changed. We can do a file integrity check. This is going to support that forensic chain of custody that we need. For looking at someone tampering with source code or logs, so we're going to be logging all actions of users so we can have a look at what anyone's doing at any one time. We want to state in employee contracts what is unacceptable behavior. So there's no, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that I wasn't supposed to be deleting the logs. Like, you knew what you were not supposed to do, you signed a contract, you were told, like, there can be repercussions for this. We want to forward all of these logs to a centralized hardened log server, with the access controls we've already discussed previously. So here we stand, and now we have our logs over in there. We're going to make sure that we have the controls that we want around who can access it, and we've got the employee contracts listed here as well. Repudiation. We aren't doing much here, but again, this is something that you should potentially be thinking about for your application when you're running through this process. Information disclosure. Around the problem where they said that we're worried about when footage is submitted to court and the identity of someone could be disclosed that we don't necessarily want. I said, well, okay, what we can do then is we can put a policy in place to say that, okay, well, before anything is submitted to court, you'll sit down with your legal team and you will have a look at the footage and you'll try to weed out any of these cases where someone is clearly visible and you know that that person does not want to be present. So we'll try to put something in there to mitigate that at least, even though it's not a threat to the application itself. It's involving the application and it's still something that we can do something about, so we'll do it. We also want to be removing metadata from the footage so that we know that we're releasing as little information about our users as possible. And again, when more technical people come onto the team, this is the area that we really want to hone in on. So this is where we stand. We're now removing metadata and we now have a policy to review footage before it's submitted to court. Denial of service. So for the two different types of denial of service that we've identified, so for where someone is just DDoSing our cloud server, we want to make sure that we're employing some mitigation service such as Cloudflare, and to prevent someone just eating up our storage by continually uploading into it, we want to cap the amount of information a user can actually send to that cloud storage. So here we are, and now we've got some of our DDoS mitigation in place. Elevation of privilege being the last one. The problem there being someone gaining admin when they should not have it to the code repo of the cloud storage. We've already discussed this a little bit, so we're already logging actions of users, and basically we want to enumerate some basic cases that are going to generate some alerts. We're going to make sure that alerts are going to at least two people. It's easy to corrupt one person, much harder to corrupt two, even again for three, etc. So we want to make sure that at least two people are getting alerts when new admins are created. We want to make sure that people are getting alerts if multiple admin accounts just come out of thin air. We want to make sure someone's getting alerts if admins are logging in at 2 in the morning and doing things they've never done before. Just usage that's out of the ordinary, that should be flagged and someone should be checking that. So we've already got the information that we discussed around what's happening with the logs. And then the final point over there is we're going to have that review of legislation because we're operating across multiple legal jurisdictions, transferring data from one to the other. They should be having a look at that as well. So this is basically where we get to with our very basic, bare bones threat modeling process. Now, as I said, this is very, very basic. Taking this further, you want to go lower. You want to be understanding the technology you're using, understanding the different protocols involved, enumerating all the different functionality that you have. You can also be thinking about placing more controls in there. So people can bypass a single control. They can be bypassed, they can be circumvented, controls can just fail. You need to make sure that you have multiple controls there. So as an example, like, you know, when you set an alarm to wake up in the morning and then you think, well, I may sleep through that alarm, so I'm going to set 2 alarms. That's defense in depth. And we want to make sure that we're building that into the application that we're working on. Make this an iterative process, so do this periodically, just continually go through it. If you have a new release and you've got new technology and new functionality involved, your threat model has changed. You need to go through this process again to make sure you're on top of all the different things that can go wrong. And make sure you're assigning responsibility of this process to someone, otherwise, again, it's not going to get done. So this is where we started, completely blank canvas, not knowing anything. This is where a non-technical group got to, having a look at some very basic information and coming up with a very basic network diagram. And this is where we ended up. Now, even though this is a very bare bones process that doesn't cover everything you need to be doing for application threat modeling, this is still, like between this and this is still a much stronger security posture. Now, finally to close out, the 3 things that I want you to take away. If you know absolutely nothing about threat modeling and you want to be doing this yourself for applications you're working on, just think of these 3 questions and then the acronym that'll help you for thinking what's going wrong. So what is it that you're building? Because you cannot protect what you don't understand. What can go wrong? And you're going to use Stride to work out all the different things. And then finally, what are you going to do about it? What controls are you putting in place to mitigate those problems? This is the information that I used as resources when I was working with Asuntos del Sur, so you can have a look at the same information that I did should you so want to. That's it. Do we have any questions? Cool. Thank you so much for listening, guys.